The handprint on the inside of the access hatch wasn't mine. I know because I'd climbed up that ladder maybe 200 times in the past month, and I'd never once pressed my palm flat against the underside of that metal door. The print was too large, the fingers too long, and when I aimed my flashlight at it, the residue caught the light in a way that made my stomach turn. It wasn't dirt or grease or rust. It was something wet, something that had stayed wet despite the Texas heat that turned the exterior of the tower into a griddle by noon. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My name doesn't matter much, but what I do does. Or did, I guess, depending on how you look at it. I'm the maintenance operator for the Carrizo Springs Water Tower, about 15 miles outside of a town so small you'd miss it if you blinked while driving through. Population 347, give or take whoever died or was born that week. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the dollar store is the biggest building on Main Street, and where the water tower stands like a rusted sentinel on the edge of town, visible for miles across the flat scrubland. I took the job because I needed the money and because I thought, how hard could it be? Check the water levels, monitor the pressure gauges, climbed a ladder once a week to inspect the tank, make sure the pump system is running. Standard utility work. The pay was decent, better than I could get anywhere else within 50 miles, and the apartment that came with it wasn't half bad. Small, sure, but it sat right at the base of the tower, which meant no commute. The previous operator, a man named Curtis Webb, had worked the tower for 11 years before he retired. That's what they told me anyway. Retired. The word sat funny in my mouth from the start, but I didn't think much of it during the interview. The water district supervisor, a thin woman named Patricia Escobar, said Curtis had decided to move closer to his daughter in San Antonio. Natural progression for a man pushing 70. Made sense on paper. I met Curtis exactly once. It was my first day, a scorching afternoon in late August when the temperature hit 106 degrees by 2 in the afternoon. He was waiting for me outside the apartment, a wiry old man with sun-weathered skin and eyes that seemed too pale, like they'd been bleached by years of staring at the sky. He didn't smile when I introduced myself, just nodded and gestured for me to follow him.
The tour took maybe 40 minutes. He showed me the pump house, the pressure system, the chlorination equipment, the backup generator. He walked me through the daily logs, the maintenance schedule, the emergency protocols. His voice was flat the entire time, mechanical, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized years ago and was tired of repeating. When we reached the base of the tower, he stopped and looked up at it, shading his eyes against the brutal sun. The tower itself was nothing special. Standard elevated water tank, the kind you see dotting the landscape across rural America. 100 feet tall, cylindrical steel tank painted white with Carrizo Springs stenciled in faded blue letters. A ladder with a safety cage ran up the outside, and at the top, a small platform circled the tank with an access hatch leading inside. "You'll need to climb up once a week," Curtis said, not looking at me. "Check the interior. Look for rust, sediment buildup, anything unusual in the water." "Unusual like what?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, too long. Then he said, "You'll know it when you see it." Before I could ask what he meant, he handed me a small spiral-bound notebook. The cover was water-stained and bent, the edges soft with age. "This is for you," he said. "Read it tonight. All of it." I took it, flipping through the pages. They were filled with handwritten notes, dated entries going back years, maybe decades. Different handwriting, different ink colors. "What is this?" "Rules," Curtis said. He finally looked at me, and something in his eyes made my throat tight. "For keeping things running smooth, for keeping yourself safe." Safe from what? He didn't answer, just turned and walked to his truck, which was already packed with boxes and suitcases. He drove away without saying goodbye, leaving me standing in the shadow of the tower with a notebook full of rules I hadn't read yet. That night, alone in the apartment with the AC struggling against the heat, I opened the notebook. The first entry was dated 1983, written in cramped, slanting handwriting. Rule 1. Never enter the tank after sundown. No matter what you hear up there, wait until morning. I read it twice, frowning. Then I turned the page. Rule 2. If the water level drops more than 6 inches overnight, do not investigate alone. Call the district supervisor immediately. Do not go up the ladder. Rule 3. If you see ripples on the water's surface when there's no wind, leave the platform immediately. Do not look down into the tank. Rule 4. The access hatch locks from the outside. Always, always lock it behind you after an inspection. Check the lock twice. Rule 5. If you hear knocking from inside the tank during the day, ignore it. It will stop eventually. Rule 6. Do not drink the water from the tower. Use the apartment's separate well water for all personal consumption. Rule 7. If the water in the tank turns dark during an inspection, close the hatch immediately and do not return for 48 hours. Rule 8. Do not respond to voices calling your name from inside the tank. You will recognize the voice. It is not who you think it is. Rule 9. If you see something moving beneath the surface, document it in this notebook with the date and time, then leave. Do not attempt to identify it. Rule 10. Every 6 months, you will find an envelope in your mailbox with no return address. Follow the instructions inside exactly. There were more. Dozens more, each one stranger than the last. Different handwriting for different rules, like multiple people had contributed to this notebook over the years. The dates ranged from the 80s all the way to last month. Curtis's handwriting appeared in the most recent entries, his notes sparse and clinical. August 3rd, heard knocking at 2 p.m., stopped after 20 minutes. August 9th, water level dropped 8 inches overnight. Called Patricia, did not inspect tank. August 15th, saw movement, dark shape approximately 6 feet long, did not stay to observe. I should have been skeptical. I wanted to be, but something about the way Curtis had looked at me when he handed over that notebook made it impossible to dismiss. The rules felt less like superstition and more like warnings, the kind written by people who'd learned hard lessons and wanted to spare others the same experience. I closed the notebook and set it on the kitchen table. Through the window, I could see the tower rising against the dark sky, illuminated by a single floodlight at its base. It looked ordinary, just a water tower, just a job. I wish I'd left it at that. But when you're told not to do something, when you're given rules without explanation, it plants a seed, a need to know why, a need to understand. That seed grew over the next week as I settled into the routine. Check the pumps, monitor the pressure, record the readings. Each day I'd glance up at the tower, wondering what was up there that required so many warnings. It wasn't until my 8th day on the job that I climbed the ladder for the first time. The climb took about 10 minutes. The safety cage around the ladder made it less terrifying than it could have been, but by the time I reached the top platform, my legs were shaking. The view stretched for miles in every direction, nothing but flat scrubland and the thin ribbon of highway cutting through it. The town was a small cluster of buildings to the east, shimmering in the heat. The access hatch was a circular steel door, maybe 3 feet in diameter, with a wheel lock in the center. It took both hands to turn it, the metal groaning as the lock disengaged. I lifted the hatch and was hit immediately by the smell. Not rotten exactly, but organic, like standing water and something else I couldn't identify. Mineral, maybe. Metallic. I clipped my safety harness to the rail and clicked on my flashlight, leaning over to peer inside. The tank was roughly 40 feet in diameter, the water level sitting about 15 feet below the hatch. The surface was still, reflecting the circle of sunlight from above like a dark mirror. The interior walls were coated in a thin layer of rust and algae, normal for a tank this old. Everything looked fine. But then I noticed the smell again, stronger now, and something about the quality of the water seemed off. Too dark, maybe, or too still. I aimed my flashlight down at the surface and saw my own reflection staring back at me, distorted by the ripples my breathing caused. That's when I heard it, a soft sound like fabric dragging across metal. It came from inside the tank, somewhere below the waterline. I froze. The sound stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing but the wind across the scrubland and the distant hum of the highway. Then the sound came again, louder this time, rhythmic, deliberate, like something was moving down there, something large enough to disturb the water. Rule 3 echoed in my head. If you see ripples on the water's surface when there's no wind, leave the platform immediately. Do not look down into the tank. But this wasn't ripples. This was a sound. Did that count? I leaned further over the hatch, trying to see through the murky water. The flashlight beam caught something pale moving beneath the surface, just for a second, before it disappeared into the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I pulled back from the hatch, suddenly very aware of how exposed I was on that platform, 100 feet in the air, with nothing but a thin railing between me and a long drop. I lowered the hatch and spun the lock, checking it twice like Rule 4 instructed. Then I climbed down the ladder so fast I nearly missed a rung halfway down. Back in the apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me. I flipped to a blank page and wrote my first entry. September 3rd. Inspected tank at 11 a.m. Heard dragging sound from inside. Saw pale shape moving underwater. Did not stay to observe. I stared at what I'd written, my handwriting looking small and shaky on the page. Then I closed the notebook and tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a bird that had gotten into the tank somehow, algae moving with the current from the inlet pipe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been looking back at me from beneath that dark water, something that knew I was there. The next few days passed without incident, which somehow made it worse. I found myself watching the tower constantly, even when I was inside the apartment. The floodlight at its base stayed on all night, casting long shadows that moved with the wind. Sometimes I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and look out the window, half expecting to see something climbing the ladder or standing on the platform. Nothing ever was, just the tower, silent and still. On my 12th day, I found the first envelope. It was in my mailbox at the end of the driveway, a plain white envelope with no return address and no postage. My name was written on the front in careful block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with instructions typed on an old typewriter, the letters slightly uneven.
On September 15th at 2 a.m., you will climb the tower and open the access hatch. Do not enter the tank. Pour the contents of the enclosed bottle into the water. Close the hatch immediately and return to the apartment. Do not look into the tank while pouring. Do not speak while on the platform. Taped to the bottom of the paper was a small glass bottle filled with dark liquid. It looked like molasses, thick and opaque. There was no label. I read the instructions 3 times, my mind racing. This was Rule 10, the envelope that arrived every 6 months. But Curtis had only been gone for 12 days. That meant this was scheduled for me specifically. Someone knew I was here. Someone was watching. The date on the instruction was 9 days away. I had time to think about it, to decide if I was actually going to follow through. But even as I told myself I could refuse, could call Patricia and ask what the hell was going on, I knew I wouldn't.
because part of me needed to know what would happen. Part of me needed to understand what this was all about. If these stories are making you check your locks tonight, consider subscribing for more horror stories every week. September 15th came faster than I wanted. I spent the days leading up to it trying to act normal, following my routine, checking the pumps, and recording the readings like nothing was different. But every time I looked at that tower, every time I thought about climbing it in the dead of night, my stomach twisted into knots. At 1:45 a.m., I stood at the base of the ladder with the bottle in my pocket and a flashlight clipped to my belt. The night was moonless, the sky a vast expanse of stars that seemed too bright and too close. The tower loomed above me, its white surface glowing faintly in the floodlight. I started climbing. Each rung felt like it took forever, my breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. The safety cage around me felt like a prison now, trapping me in this upward journey I couldn't escape. By the time I reached the top, my hands were slick with sweat despite the cool night air.
The platform was darker than I expected. The floodlight from below didn't reach this high, and my flashlight threw strange shadows across the metal surface. I approached the hatch and placed my hand on the wheel lock. That's when I heard it. A voice, muffled and distant, coming from inside the tank. Hello? I froze. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. Male, middle-aged, with a slight drawl. Is someone there? I need help. My hand was still on the lock. The instruction had said not to speak while on the platform, but someone was in the tank. Someone needed help. How could I ignore that? Please, the voice said, closer now. Please, I can't get out. The hatch is locked. Just open it, please. I recognized the voice then. It was Curtis, the old operator, the man who'd handed me this job and driven away without looking back. But Curtis was in San Antonio with his daughter, wasn't he? Rule 8 crashed into my consciousness like cold water. Do not respond to voices calling your name from inside the tank. You will recognize the voice. It is not who you think it is. My hand pulled away from the lock like it had been burned. The voice inside the tank changed immediately, the pleading tone shifting to something flat and cold. Open the hatch. I pulled the bottle from my pocket with shaking hands. The instructions said to open the hatch and pour without looking. But if I opened it, if that voice got out, I know you can hear me, the voice said, no longer Curtis's voice, something else now, something that sounded like grinding metal wrapped in vocal cords. Open it. I turned the wheel lock and lifted the hatch, keeping my eyes fixed on the platform beneath my feet. The smell hit me again, stronger than before, rotten vegetation and something chemical. I uncapped the bottle and held it over the opening, trying not to think about what I was doing or why. The liquid poured slowly, thick and viscous. It made a soft splashing sound as it hit the water below. I kept my eyes down, watching my own feet, resisting the overwhelming urge to look into the tank. Look at me, the voice said. I didn't. I finished pouring, capped the empty bottle, and lowered the hatch. The voice cut off the instant the metal sealed shut. I spun the lock with trembling hands, checking it twice, then a third time for good measure.
The climb down was a blur. I barely remember touching the rungs, just the desperate need to be back on solid ground, back in the apartment with the door locked and the lights on. I made it inside and sat on the floor with my back against the door, breathing hard, the empty bottle still clutched in my hand. Whatever was in that tank, it wasn't water anymore, or not just water, and someone in this town knew about it. Someone had been feeding it for decades, following these rules, pouring mysterious liquids into the tank in the middle of the night. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start looking.
The Carrizo Springs Town Hall was a small brick building on Main Street, sharing space with the volunteer fire department and the county clerk's office. I arrived when it opened at 9, still exhausted from the previous night, but too wired to sleep. The clerk was a woman in her 60s named Helen, who looked at me over her reading glasses with mild curiosity. "Help you with something?" "I'm looking for records on the water tower," I said. "Construction documents, maintenance logs, anything historical." She frowned. "That's Water District business. You'd need to talk to Patricia Escobar." "I work for the Water District. I'm the new operator. Patricia told me to familiarize myself with the tower's history. A lie, but a small one." Helen considered this, then shrugged. "Maintenance logs are kept at the district office, but we've got some old construction records in the archive. Give me a minute." She disappeared into a back room and returned 10 minutes later with a cardboard box covered in dust. "This is what we've got. Tower was built in 1982. Original construction company went out of business in the 90s, but the paperwork's all here." I took the box to a corner table and started going through it. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Building permits, contractor agreements, safety inspections. But buried near the bottom, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a letter dated April 1982, written on Water District letterhead and signed by someone named James Whitmore. The letter was addressed to the construction foreman and marked "Confidential" in red stamp across the top.
Regarding your concerns about the water quality issue discovered during initial tank testing, we have consulted with appropriate specialists and determined that the anomaly poses no immediate health risk to the public water supply. The filtration system will adequately address any concerns. Construction should proceed as planned. The matter will be monitored internally going forward. Under no circumstances should this issue be discussed with residents or local media. All relevant documentation should be forwarded to this office for secure storage. Water quality issue. Anomaly. The words were vague enough to mean anything, but specific enough to mean something was wrong from the very beginning. And they'd built the tower anyway. They'd connected it to the town's water supply, knowing there was a problem. I kept digging through the box. There had to be more. Reports, test results, something that explained what they'd found. But the rest of the documents were completely ordinary. It was like someone had carefully removed every piece of evidence that might answer my questions, leaving only that one letter as a hint of something larger. I photographed it with my phone and returned the box to Helen. "Did you know James Whitmore?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "He was the Water District supervisor before Patricia died about 15 years ago. Heart attack." "What was he like?" "Quiet man, kept to himself. Worked that job for 30 years without a complaint." She paused. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the tower's history," I said. "Thanks for your help." I left the town hall and sat in my truck, staring at the photo of the letter on my phone. 30 years James Whitmore had worked for the Water District. 30 years of knowing something was wrong with that tower and never saying a word. And then he died, and Patricia had taken over, and the secrets had kept right on being secrets. How many people knew? How many people in this town understood that something was living in their water supply?
I drove back to the apartment and spent the rest of the afternoon researching. I searched every combination of keywords I could think of. Water contamination, Texas water quality, Carrizo Springs, the tower's construction company. Nothing came up that seemed relevant. It was like the anomaly, whatever it was, had been completely scrubbed from the public record. But private records were different. Someone in town had to remember. Someone had to know more than they were letting on. That evening, I went to the only bar in Carrizo Springs, a dim little place called the Watering Hole that smelled like stale beer and fried food. It was mostly empty, just a handful of locals nursing drinks and watching a baseball game on the TV above the bar. I ordered a beer and sat down next to an old man who looked like he'd been part of the furniture for decades. He glanced at me, then back at his drink. "You're the new tower operator," he said. It wasn't a question. "Word travels fast. Down this small, everything travels fast." He took a long pull from his beer. "How you liking the job?" "It's interesting," I said carefully, "learning a lot about the town's water system." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I bet you are. These stories get even darker. If you're enjoying this, hit the like button, comment, and subscribe." I decided to take a risk. "Did you know Curtis Webb?" Everyone knew Curtis. Good man. Glad he finally got out. Out? The old man looked at me directly for the first time. That job changes people. Curtis lasted longer than most. 11 years is practically a record. What do you mean, longer than most? He was quiet for a moment, studying me. Then he said, "There have been 6 operators since the tower was built. You're number 7. Curtis was there the longest. Before him was Maria Gonzalez, lasted about 9 years. Before her was Tom Hendricks, 7 years. Pattern keeps going back to the beginning." "What happened to them?" "Same thing that happened to Curtis. They left, moved away, got out while they could." He drained his beer and set the glass down harder than necessary. Smart thing to do, if you ask me. "But why? What's wrong with the tower?" The old man stood up, pulling a few bills from his wallet and dropping them on the bar. "You already know something's wrong, otherwise you wouldn't be here asking questions." He looked at me with something between pity and warning. "Best advice I can give you, follow the rules, keep your head down, and start looking for a new job. This place will eat you up if you let it." He left before I could ask anything else. I sat there nursing my beer, thinking about what he'd said. 6 operators in 40 years, none of them staying longer than 11 years, all of them eventually leaving without looking back.
What had they seen in that tank? What had driven them away? I finished my drink and drove back to the apartment. The tower loomed against the darkening sky, its surface painted orange by the setting sun. Somewhere inside it, beneath thousands of gallons of water, something was waiting. Something that had been there since 1982, maybe longer. Something the town had decided to live with rather than confront. And I was the fool who was supposed to keep it contained. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind made me tense. I kept thinking about the voice in the tank, the way it had mimicked Curtis so perfectly before revealing its true nature. About the pale shape I'd seen moving beneath the water, about the rules that existed to keep people safe from something everyone pretended didn't exist. Around 2 a.m, I heard knocking. Soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the AC, but persistent. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I sat up in bed, my heart already racing. The sound was coming from outside. I got up and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. The tower stood in the darkness. The floodlight at its base casting long shadows. As I watched, the knocking came again, and I realized where it was coming from. The tank. The sound was echoing down the tower's metal structure, transmitting through the framework to the ground. Something inside was knocking on the walls of the tank. Rule 5. If you hear knocking from inside the tank during the day, ignore it. It will stop eventually. But this was night. The rule didn't say anything about nighttime knocking. Did that mean it was worse? Or that it never happened at night, so the rule wasn't necessary? The knocking continued. 3 slow knocks. Pause. 3 more. Over and over. Rhythmic and deliberate. Like something trying to communicate, or like something testing the walls, searching for a weak point.
I closed the curtain and backed away from the window. The knocking went on for another 20 minutes before it finally stopped, leaving the night silent except for the distant sound of highway traffic. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, just sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching the tower through the window, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did, But I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was in that tank was getting restless, and sooner or later I was going to have to go up there again. 4 days later, the water level dropped. I noticed it during my morning check of the monitoring system. The digital readout showed the tank at 73% capacity. Yesterday, it had been at 92%. Overnight, approximately 15,000 gallons had vanished. Rule 2. If the water level drops more than 6 inches overnight, do not investigate alone. Call the district supervisor immediately. Do not go up the ladder. I pulled out my phone and called Patricia. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice professional and clipped. What's wrong? The water level dropped 19 inches overnight, over 15,000 gallons. There was a long pause. Are you certain? I'm looking at the monitoring system right now. Yesterday's log shows 92%. Current reading is 73. Another pause, longer this time. I'll be there in an hour. Don't go up the tower. Don't do anything until I arrive. She hung up before I could respond. An hour felt like forever. I paced the apartment, checking the monitoring system every few minutes, like the numbers might suddenly change back to normal. They didn't. If anything, the water levels seemed to be dropping further. By the time Patricia's truck pulled up the driveway, the tank was at 71%.
She climbed out wearing work coveralls and safety boots, a hard hat tucked under her arm. Her face was calm, but I could see tension in the way she moved, the way her eyes immediately went to the tower. "Show me the logs," she said without preamble. I pulled up the monitoring system on my laptop. She studied the numbers for a long moment, then nodded. "Has the inlet flow rate changed?" "No, pump's been running normal all night. Output to the distribution system is normal too. The water's not going anywhere. It's just gone." "It's not gone," Patricia said quietly. "It's just moved." "What does that mean?" She looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something other than professional competence in her eyes. I saw fear, real bone-deep fear that she was trying very hard to hide. "Come with me," she said. We climbed the tower together. Patricia moved with the ease of someone who'd made this climb hundreds of times, but I noticed she kept one hand on her radio and the other on the railing, like she was ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. We reached the platform and she immediately checked the hatch lock, rattling it to make sure it was secure. "Did you check this when you came down yesterday?" "Twice," I said. "It was locked." She nodded and pulled out a pressure gauge from her tool belt, attaching it to a small valve on the side of the tank. The needle jumped and settled, and her expression darkened. "Tank pressure is elevated. That explains the water level." "How does pressure explain missing water?" Instead of answering, she disconnected the gauge and turned to face me. "What I'm about to tell you stays between us. You don't discuss it with anyone in town. You don't write about it. You don't post it online. Do you understand?" "What's in the tank, Patricia?"
She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the scrubland. In 1982, during initial testing of the tank, the construction crew discovered an underground aquifer connected to the bottom of the foundation. It's not shown on any geological surveys. It shouldn't exist based on the rock formations in this area, but it's there. An aquifer? A cave system, deep, filled with water that's chemically different from anything else in the region. The construction foreman wanted to report it, but James Whitmore shut him down. The district was already over budget. They'd promised the federal government they'd have the tower operational by a specific deadline. So Whitmore made a decision. He sealed off the aquifer entrance with a pressure valve and built the tower anyway. That's insane. The EPA would have shut it down. Which is why no one told the EPA. She turned back to me.
The aquifer water has unique properties. It's mineral-rich, yes, but there's something else, something organic. The filtration system handles it, neutralizes most of the compounds before the water goes into the distribution system. But the original concentration, the stuff in the aquifer itself, that's still down there, and it's still connected to this tank. My mouth had gone dry. What kind of organic compounds? The kind that shouldn't exist, Patricia said. James Whitmore took samples, had them analyzed by private labs. The results didn't make sense. Proteins that matched no known database, chemical structures that violated standard biological models, so he sealed the records and established protocols. The rules. The rules. She looked at me steadily. They're not superstition, they're survival. Every operator before you has had to learn that the hard way. Curtis followed them for 11 years without a single incident. That's why he lasted so long. But what's actually down there in the aquifer? Patricia's expression went carefully blank. I don't know, and neither did James. What he did know was that if you follow the rules, if you maintain the pressure balance and don't disturb what's below, everything stays contained. The town gets clean water, and whatever's in that cave system stays where it belongs. And when the water level drops, when pressure changes, that's when things get unstable. She checked the gauge again. The pressure's equalized now. Water from the aquifer pushed up into the tank to balance it out. It'll settle over the next few days. In the meantime, you need to increase chlorination and let the filtration system cycle through. The water will be safe for distribution. I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. You're saying we're pumping contaminated water into people's homes?
We're pumping treated water that exceeds all EPA standards, Patricia said firmly. The filtration works. It's been tested monthly for 40 years. No one in Carrizo Springs has ever gotten sick from the water supply. That you know of. She stepped closer and her voice dropped. This isn't something you fix by making phone calls. You don't expose this and become a hero. You follow the rules, you keep your head down, and you do your job. That's how this works. And if I can't do that, then you resign, like every other operator who couldn't handle it. She pulled her radio from her belt. But if you quit, someone else takes over. Someone who doesn't know the rules yet. Someone who might make a mistake. She let that hang in the air. Think about that before you decide you're going to be a whistleblower. She started down the ladder without waiting for a response. I stood alone on the platform, looking at the hatch. Beneath it, thousands of gallons of water mixed with something from an aquifer that shouldn't exist, something with proteins that matched no known database, something alive enough to create pressure changes and knock on metal walls in the middle of the night. I thought about Curtis, who'd lasted 11 years before finally escaping, about the 5 operators before him who'd each reached their breaking point and fled, about the next person who'd take this job if I left, armed with nothing but a notebook full of rules they'd have no reason to believe. I climbed down slowly, my mind made up. I wasn't leaving, not yet, until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. That night, I violated my first rule. Rule 1. Never enter the tank after sundown. No matter what you hear up there, wait until morning. It was stupid, reckless, but I needed to see inside that tank when it was dark, when whatever lived in that water felt safe enough to move around. I needed to know what I was sharing this place with. I waited until 11, when the town had gone quiet and the highway traffic had thinned to nothing. Then I grabbed my flashlight, clipped on my safety harness, and started climbing. The ladder seemed longer in the dark, each rung taking me further from the safety of the ground. The floodlight below cast strange shadows that moved with me, making it feel like something was climbing beneath me, matching my pace.
The platform was pitch black, except for my flashlight. I stood at the hatch for a long moment, my hand on the wheel lock, listening. Nothing but the wind and the distant hum of the pump system. The smell hit me the moment I opened the hatch, that organic rot smell mixed with minerals. I leaned over carefully, aiming my flashlight into the darkness. The water was impossible to see through, not murky exactly, but dark in a way that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My flashlight beam penetrated maybe a foot before disappearing into blackness. I angled it different ways, trying to see deeper, when something moved. Not in the water, on the wall. About 5 feet below the surface, something pale and elongated was pressed against the interior of the tank. It looked like a hand at first, fingers splayed wide against the metal. But the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and there were too many joints in each digit, bending in ways that made my eyes hurt to follow. I pulled back instinctively, but I couldn't look away. The thing moved slowly, deliberately, climbing up the interior wall toward the hatch, toward me. Other shapes emerged from the darkness below it, more hands or what looked like hands, dozens of them pressing against the metal and pulling upward. Some were larger, some smaller. None of them looked human once you really studied them. The smell intensified, and I realized with horror that the water level was rising, not dropping this time, rising. The pressure from below was pushing water up the tank, bringing whatever was climbing with it. The hands were maybe 3 feet below the hatch now, close enough that I could see details. The skin, if you could call it that, was translucent, revealing structures underneath that might have been bone or might have been something else entirely. There was no blood, no veins, just a pale lattice of material that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. One of them reached the hatch opening, the fingers stretched up toward the edge, long and searching. I dropped the hatch and spun the lock with shaking hands, throwing my full weight against the wheel to make sure it was sealed. From inside, I heard a soft scratching sound as those fingers dragged across the underside of the metal door. Then silence. I backed away from the hatch, my breathing ragged. That was what lived down there. That was what the rules were designed to contain, not some abstract contamination or unknown organism. This was deliberate, intelligent, aware, and it knew I was out here.
The scratching started again, louder this time. Multiple hands working together, searching for a gap, a weakness. But the hatch held, the lock held. After a few minutes, the scratching stopped. I climbed down the ladder as fast as I dared, nearly falling twice in my rush to reach the ground. Back in the apartment, I locked every door and window and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, trying to process what I'd seen. Those things had been climbing toward me. If I'd left the hatch open any longer, if I'd leaned down just a little further, would they have grabbed me, pulled me inside? I thought about the rules again. Never entered the tank after sundown, because that's when they were active, that's when they climbed. But what happened during the day? Where did they go? The water was only 15 feet deep. There wasn't enough space to hide dozens of those things, unless they went back down into the aquifer, into whatever cave system connected to the bottom of the tank. That's why the pressure changed. When they moved between the tank and the caves below, they displaced water, changing the levels. The envelopes, the mysterious liquid I'd poured in 2 weeks ago, that must have been to keep them down there, to encourage them to stay in the darkness below rather than climb up into the tank. I pulled out the notebook and found Curtis's entries again, reading them with new understanding. Every note about water levels, about pressure changes, about sounds and movement. They weren't just observations, they were warnings, documentation of the thing's behavior so the next operator would know what to expect. I started my own entry, documenting everything I'd seen, the hands, the climbing, the way they'd moved together, coordinated. When I finished writing, I added something Curtis had never written,
a question that I needed answered even if no one else ever read it. What happens if they get out?
The next morning, I called in sick. Patricia didn't argue, just told me to take the day and rest. I think she knew. I think she understood that seeing the thing, really seeing it, required time to process, time to decide if you could keep going. I spent the day researching, not the tower or the water district this time. I went deeper, looking for similar incidents anywhere else in the country. Underground cave systems connected to water supplies, unexplained contamination, operators who'd quit without explanation. It took hours of searching through obscure forums and archived news articles, but I finally found something. A small town in New Mexico, population 400, had experienced a similar situation in the 70s. An underground aquifer with unusual chemical properties had been discovered during construction of their water tower. The project was completed anyway, and for 20 years everything seemed fine. Then one summer, during a severe drought, the water level in the tower dropped significantly. 3 days later, every fish in the nearby river died. Then the livestock started getting sick. Then people started disappearing. The town was evacuated within a week. The tower was decommissioned and filled with concrete. The official report blamed industrial contamination, but I found an interview with the former water district supervisor buried in a conspiracy website's archives. He said the same thing Patricia had told me. They'd sealed off something they didn't understand. They'd tried to manage it with protocols and rules, and when those failed, when the balance was disrupted, the thing below had reached out. 7 people disappeared from that town before they sealed the tower. 7 people who'd lived near the water supply, who'd used it every day, who'd slowly accumulated enough of the contamination in their system to become, marked, infected, connected? I closed my laptop and stared out the window at the tower. How long had Carrizo Springs been living on borrowed time? How many people in this town had enough of that water in their system to be at risk if something went wrong? The knocking started again that night, same pattern as before. 3 slow knocks, pause, repeat. But this time there was a difference. After the 3rd sequence, I heard something else, a low vibration that I felt more than heard, resonating through the building's foundation. It lasted about 30 seconds, then stopped. The knocking resumed. 3 knocks, pause, the vibration, repeat.
I went outside and walked around the tower's base, following the sound. The vibration was coming from the ground itself, transmitted up through the tower's foundation. Something below was making noise. Something in the cave system was communicating with the things in the tank. Or something in the tank was calling down to the caves. The pattern continued for an hour before finally stopping. I went back inside and added it to the notebook. October 9th. Knocking, accompanied by ground vibration. Communication pattern. The next day, I found fresh scratch marks on the interior of the access hatch. Deep gouges in the metal that definitely hadn't been there before. Whatever was down there had gotten more aggressive, more determined. The rules were holding, but just barely. I was running out of time to figure out what to do. The second envelope arrived on October 12th. Same plain white paper, same typed instructions, but this time the message was different. On October 18th at 2 a.m., you will enter the tank. Bring a waterproof flashlight and the breathing apparatus from the emergency locker. Descend to the bottom intake valve. You will find a junction box marked with a red X. Open it and flip the manual override switch inside. Surface immediately. Do not stay submerged longer than 5 minutes. Do not remove your breathing equipment until you are back on the platform. My hands shook as I read it. Enter the tank. Go down into that water with those things? This wasn't maintenance.
This wasn't a simple procedure. This was suicide. I called Patricia immediately. I got another envelope. What does it say? I read her the instructions.
She was quiet for a long time. "Can I refuse?" I asked. "Yes." "What happens if I do?" Another pause. "The system destabilizes. Without the manual override, the pressure valve stays closed. Water from the aquifer continues building up in the tank. Eventually, it overflows or ruptures the tank. Either way, the contamination spreads." "How much time do we have?" "Based on historical pressure readings, maybe 2 weeks before it becomes critical." "And if I go down there, what's the override actually do?" "It opens a secondary valve that releases pressure back into the aquifer, resets the balance. We've had to do it 3 times since 1982. Once in 1991, once in 2003, once in 2014. Who did it those times?" "The operators who were here. They all survived. But they all quit eventually." "Yes." Patricia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Look, I can't make you do this. If you want to resign, I'll understand. I'll find someone else. But whoever takes your place will be going blind. They won't know what they're facing until it's too late." I thought about Curtis, about the way he looked at me when he handed over the notebook, about the relief in his eyes as he drove away. He'd done this. He'd gone down into that tank and done whatever needed doing, and it had broken something in him, but he'd survived. "What's really down there?" I asked. "Not the technical explanation, the truth."
Patricia was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then she said, "I don't know. Neither did James. But he believed it was old. Older than the cave system. Older than the aquifer. He thought the water didn't create it. He thought it created the water. That doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. That's the point. We're not dealing with contamination or bacteria or chemical runoff. We're dealing with something that exists outside normal biology, something that uses the water as a medium, a tool, maybe even a body. And we're supposed to just live with it? Keep pumping it into people's homes? The filtration works. The contamination doesn't survive the treatment process. What comes out of people's taps is safe water." She paused. "But what stays in the tank, what lives in the aquifer, that's different. That's what the rules manage. That's what the procedures contain. Until they don't. Until they don't," she agreed. I hung up and spent the rest of the day preparing. The emergency locker contained exactly what the instructions promised. A full-face breathing apparatus with 2 hours of air, waterproof flashlight, safety tether. I tested everything twice, then put it all back and tried not to think about what I was going to do. The days leading up to October 18th crawled by. I maintained my routine, checked the systems, followed the rules. But every time I looked at that tower, I felt its weight pressing down on me, the knowledge of what was inside, what I was going to have to face. The night before, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through the procedure over and over in my mind. Suit up, climb the tower, open the hatch, descend into the water, find the junction box, flip the switch, surface. Simple steps that felt impossible. At 1:30 a.m. on October 18th, I suited up. The breathing apparatus was heavier than I expected, the mask tight against my face. The safety tether clipped to my harness, the other end secured to the platform railing. I had maybe 60 feet of line, more than enough to reach the bottom of a 15-foot deep tank.
The climb up the tower felt like climbing to my own execution. Each rung took me closer to something I desperately wanted to avoid. But I kept going, one hand over the other, until I reached the platform. The hatch opened with its usual groan. The smell was overwhelming even through the breathing mask. I clipped the flashlight to my chest and lowered myself through the opening, my feet finding the interior ladder rungs. The metal was slick, covered in something that felt like algae but had a texture that made my skin crawl even through the gloves. I descended slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the murky water as I went under the surface.
The water was cold, much colder than I expected. It pressed against the suit, and I could feel the current from the intake valve somewhere below me. The visibility was maybe 2 feet. Beyond that, just darkness. My feet touched something soft. I nearly let go of the ladder before realizing it was sediment, the bottom of the tank. I oriented myself, trying to remember the blueprint I'd studied. The junction box should be on the south wall, about 3 feet up from the bottom. I pushed off the ladder and followed the wall, keeping one hand on the metal surface. The flashlight beam swept across the interior, revealing rust and algae and something else. Long, pale streaks that looked like the marks something had made while climbing. Fresh ones based on how they caught the light. The junction box was right where it should be, a metal rectangle about the size of a briefcase with a red X painted on it. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't budge. Rust or pressure, I couldn't tell which. I pulled harder, bracing my feet against the tank wall. That's when I felt something brush against my leg. I spun, the flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the water. Nothing, just darkness and sediment stirred up by my movement. But I'd felt it, something smooth and cold that had touched my leg deliberately, exploratory. I turned back to the junction box and pulled with everything I had. The handle gave way suddenly, nearly making me lose my grip on the ladder. Inside was a series of valves and switches, all labeled with faded tags. The manual override was clearly marked, a large red lever in the center. I reached for it just as something grabbed my ankle.
The grip was firm, impossibly strong, fingers wrapping completely around the suit. I looked down and saw one of those hands, the pale, translucent flesh pressed against the black material. More hands emerged from the darkness, reaching up toward me. 12, 20, more. They moved together, coordinated, pulling me away from the wall. I kicked hard, trying to shake them off, but they held on. The breathing mask limited my vision. I couldn't see how many there were, or where they were all coming from. More hands grabbed my other leg, my waist, my arms. They were everywhere, pulling me down toward the bottom of the tank. Panic hit like ice water. I grabbed the manual override lever and pulled with everything I had. The switch flipped with a heavy clunk that I felt through the entire tank. Immediately, the pressure changed. Water began draining from somewhere below, flowing back into the aquifer through the now open valve. The hands released me all at once. In the flashlight beam, I saw them retreating back down through a gap at the bottom of the tank I hadn't noticed before. An opening maybe 3 feet across, leading down into darkness far deeper than 15 feet. That's where they came from. That's where they lived. As the water level dropped rapidly, I caught a glimpse of what lay below. The gap opened into a vast cavern, the ceiling just barely visible in the murky water. And pressed against that ceiling, staring up at me with eyes that reflected the flashlight beam like a cat's eyes, was something large. Something that made the hands look like fingers on a much, much bigger body. The water dropped below the opening, cutting off my view. I didn't wait to see more. I climbed the interior ladder as fast as the suit would allow, my lungs burning even though I was breathing filtered air. My hand slipped on the rungs twice, but I kept going, driven by pure terror. I burst through the surface and scrambled onto the platform, pulling myself up and over the hatch opening. I lay there gasping, water streaming off the suit, my whole body shaking. After a moment, I rolled over and looked back into the tank. The water level had stabilized at about 8 feet, half of what it had been. Through the murky surface, I could see the opening at the bottom clearly now. Whatever had been down there was gone, pulled back into the aquifer by the draining water. But I knew it was still there, still waiting in the caves below, patient and ancient and hungry.
I closed the hatch and locked it, checking 3 times to make sure it was secure. Then I disconnected my safety tether and climbed down, moving on autopilot. My mind couldn't process what I'd seen, didn't want to process it. Back in the apartment, I stripped off the suit with shaking hands and stood under the shower for 40 minutes, scrubbing my skin until it was raw. The water from the apartment's well felt clean, safe, nothing like the thick darkness I'd just swum through. But I couldn't stop thinking about the town's water supply, about the filtration system that supposedly made it safe, about the people who drank it every day, never knowing what it had touched before reaching their homes. I added an entry to the notebook, my handwriting barely legible. October 18th, manual override activated. Saw the source, something large at the bottom of the aquifer. Multiple appendages, eyes. Do not attempt to observe further. The override works. Do not question why. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I just sat at the window, watching the tower, wondering
What is it? I don't know. James had theories. He thought it might be some kind of prehistoric survivor, something that found its way into the cave system millions of years ago and adapted. Or maybe it's older than that. Maybe it's something that existed before life as we understand it. That's impossible. So are the hands. So is the contamination that shouldn't exist according to every biological model we have, but it's all real. She looked at me steadily. The question is, can you live with knowing it's there? I thought about that for a long time. Could I wake up every day knowing there was something in that cave system, something that created water, or lived in it, or used it as a medium to exist in our world? Could I keep checking the gauges and monitoring the pressure and following the rules, all while knowing that one mistake, one violation of protocol might let it out? How many people in town know? I asked. The water district knows, the mayor knows, some of the old-timers remember the construction, remember the stories about why the tower was built the way it was, but most people don't want to know. They want clean water from their taps and nothing else. They have a right to know what's in their water supply. Do they? Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. What would you tell them? That something lives in the cave system below their tower? That it's probably been there for thousands of years? That the water is safe to drink because we filter out the contamination, but if we ever stopped maintaining the balance, if we ever let the protocols lapse, it might reach the surface? She shook her head. That's not information that helps anyone. It just creates panic. People deserve the truth. People deserve to sleep at night. They deserve to shower and wash their dishes and water their gardens without being terrified. The truth won't give them that. The truth will just give them nightmares. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the tower. You have to make a choice. Either you accept that this is the job, that maintaining the balance is more important than exposing what's being balanced, or you walk away. And if you walk away, I need to know now so I can find someone else before the next pressure cycle.
I sat there for a long time, thinking about the people in Carrizo Springs, about the kids playing in sprinklers, about the families gathered around dinner tables, about the farmers watering their crops, all of them dependent on the tower, all of them safe as long as someone followed the rules. And I thought about what would happen if no one did, if the next operator didn't believe the rules, if they thought it was all superstition and decided to investigate, to test the boundaries, to see what would happen if they ignored the protocols. I thought about that thing at the bottom of the aquifer, with its dinner plate eyes and its pale, reaching appendages, about how it had grabbed me in the water, how strong it was, how deliberate, about what it might do if it ever reached the surface. "I'll stay," I said. Patricia nodded slowly. "Thank you." After she left, I opened the notebook and started reading through it again. All the rules, all the entries, all the documentation of 40 years of careful management. I added my own note at the end. To whoever reads this next, the rules are not metaphorical. They are precise instructions for containing something that exists outside normal biology,
Follow them exactly. Do not test them. Do not seek to understand the thing in the aquifer. Just maintain the balance and keep it contained. That's the job. That's all the job is. Anything else will cost you more than you're willing to pay. It's been 3 months since I went into the tank. 3 months of following the rules, monitor the pressure, responding to the envelopes that arrive with their strange instructions. The knocking still happens sometimes, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. The water level still fluctuates as the thing moves between the tank and the caves below. But everything stays contained. The people of Carrizo Springs go about their lives, unaware of what flows through their pipes before the filtration system makes it safe. The farmers water their fields. The kids play in the park's splash pad. The diner serves coffee made with tower water. Everything is normal, because normal is maintained by rules most people will never know exist.
I've started to understand why Curtis looked so relieved when he drove away, why Maria lasted 5 years after seeing the thing, but not longer, why none of the operators stay forever. It's not just the knowledge of what's down there, it's the responsibility of keeping it contained, of making sure no one else has to see those eyes staring up from the darkness. Sometimes I stand at the window at night and look at the tower, its white surface glowing in the floodlight, and I wonder what'll happen when I can't do this anymore, when the weight of knowing becomes too much and I have to leave, have to put this burden on someone else. Will they follow the rules? Will they understand why every protocol matters? Or will they be skeptical, like I was at first? Will they think it's all exaggeration and folklore? Will they test the boundaries? I don't know. All I can do is document everything, add my experiences to the notebook, and hope the next person takes it seriously. Hope they read Curtis's entries and Maria's observations and Tom's warnings and understand that we're not making this up. We're not trying to scare them. We're trying to save them. Because the thing in the aquifer is patient. It's been down there for longer than any of us can imagine, and it'll be there long after we're gone. The tower contains it, the protocols manage it, but it's always waiting, always testing the boundaries, always ready to reach up through the water and pull something down into the darkness. The handprint on the inside of the hatch is still there. I check it every week during my inspections, just to make sure it hasn't been joined by others. So far, it's alone. But I know that could change. I know that one missed step, one broken rule, one moment of carelessness could be all it takes.
So I follow the protocols. I check the locks twice. I never enter the tank after sundown. I pour the mysterious liquids when the envelopes arrive. I monitor the pressure and document the water levels and respond to every fluctuation exactly the way the rules tell me to. And at night, when the knocking starts, I sit in the apartment with all the lights on and remind myself that the tower is holding, the balance is maintained, the thing stays below, and the people above stay safe. That's the job. That's all the job is. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about what Patricia said, about how people deserve to sleep at night without nightmares, and I realize that's what I'm doing. I'm the one having the nightmares, so 347 people don't have to. I'm the one who knows what's in the water so they can drink it without fear. It's not the job I thought I was signing up for, but it's the job I have, and someone has to do it. The tower stands in the darkness, humming with pressure and secrets. Inside it, water flows from an aquifer that shouldn't exist, touched by something that defies explanation. Below it, in caves that stretch further than anyone has dared to explore, something ancient waits with patient hunger. And I'm the one who keeps the lock turned and the hatch sealed.